March 15, 1985. Beverly Hills, 3:47 p.m. Dean Martin was not expecting his life to change that afternoon. At 67 years old, he had grown used to quiet. The wild years were behind him. The laughter of Las Vegas showrooms had softened into memory. The clinking glasses, the smoke-filled lounges, the roar of applause, they all felt like echoes from another lifetime. He sat in a leather chair across from his attorney, a man who had handled his affairs for over 2 decades. It was supposed to be routine, estate planning, paperwork, the administrative side of fame. The kind of things aging entertainers quietly prepared for. But then the attorney opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. "This was delivered to me on August 3rd, 1976, the lawyer said carefully. "I was instructed not to give it to you until today." Dean looked at the handwriting on the front. He knew that handwriting instantly. Elvis. The letters leaned slightly to the right, bold and restless, as if even ink couldn't sit still. Dean didn't speak. He just stared. Elvis asked that this be delivered on March 15th, 1985, the lawyer continued. "Not before, not after." "Why?" Dean finally asked, his voice lower than usual. "He said you would understand." The room felt smaller. Elvis Presley had been gone for almost 8 years. Dean had mourned him privately. Publicly, he had kept his composure. That was what Dean did. He didn't show too much, didn't reveal too much. But now something from the past had reached forward and knocked on his present. Dean took the envelope. His hands trembled, something that hadn't happened on stage in decades. He opened it slowly. Inside was a thick stack of handwritten pages. 47 of them. The first page began simply, "Dear Dean, if you're reading this, it means I trusted time more than I trusted circumstances." Dean leaned back and began to read. Elvis wrote from a hotel suite in Las Vegas in 1976. But the tone wasn't dramatic, it wasn't grand, it wasn't filled with secrets. It was tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. He wrote about the pressure of being Elvis Presley versus being Elvis the man. He wrote about the loneliness of fame, how rooms full of people could still feel empty. He wrote about how applause was loud, but silence afterward was louder. He told Dean that he had begun to realize something dangerous. He had spent his entire life being needed, but very little time being known. "People love the performer," Elvis wrote. "They don't always know the person." Dean stopped there, because he understood that sentence in a way few people could. Dean Martin had built his image carefully, the cool crooner, the relaxed charmer, the effortless entertainer. But behind that image was a disciplined professional who worked harder than anyone realized. They were similar in that way. 2 public masks, 2 private men. Elvis continued. He explained why he chose March 15th, 1985. Not because of danger, not because of conspiracies, but because he believed that by 1985, enough time would have passed for perspective. He wrote, "Right now everything feels close. Emotional, raw, people react to headlines, they react to noise, but time changes how truth is received." Elvis believed Dean would need distance. Distance from grief. Distance from reputation. Distance from the version of Elvis that newspapers would freeze in history. He wanted Dean to read the letter when the world had moved on, when the legend had settled, when memory had softened. Because the letter was not about scandal. It was about confession, but not the kind people expect. It was a confession of fear. Elvis admitted he was afraid of becoming trapped inside his own myth. He feared that the bigger he became, the smaller he felt inside. He feared disappointing people. He feared saying no. He feared resting. He feared not being enough once the lights dimmed. And most of all, he feared being remembered incorrectly. Dean closed his eyes. The room felt quiet in a heavy way. Elvis wrote that Dean had always been the one person who treated him normally. No pedestal, no business angle, no pressure. Just 2 men talking about life. Dean had never asked Elvis for favors, never pushed him, never needed him to be larger than life. And Elvis never forgot that. "I chose you," Elvis wrote, "because you understand how easy it is to disappear behind your own success." Dean exhaled slowly. He remembered late-night conversations backstage, conversations about music, about fatherhood, about exhaustion, about how strange it was that millions of people felt like they owned pieces of them. Elvis wrote about regret, not scandalous regret, but simple human regret. Missing moments, missing family dinners, missing ordinary life. He wrote about how fame was not something you step out of easily. "People don't clap for you being ordinary," he wrote, "but sometimes ordinary is the bravest thing." Dean felt something tighten in his chest. Elvis explained that the reason for the delay was simple. He didn't want the letter to become part of the noise. He didn't want it leaked. He didn't want it interpreted as weakness. He wanted it read by someone who could hold it quietly. Someone who wouldn't turn it into headlines. Someone who would understand that vulnerability is not spectacle. Dean kept reading. The final page of Part 1 section ended with a line that made his hand shake again. "Dean, if I'm gone when you read this, don't let the world remember only the stage. Tell them I was human too. Tell them I tried." Dean lowered the pages. Outside the window, Lowe's angels moved as usual. Cars passed. The sun tilted west. Life continued. But inside that office, something had shifted. Dean Martin realized that this letter wasn't explaining scandal. It was explaining a soul. And he had 8 more years of silence between Elvis's death and this moment. 8 years where he had carried assumptions. 8 years where he had thought he understood. Now he wasn't so sure. He looked at the remaining pages. There was more. Much more. And what Elvis was about to say next would not accuse anyone. It would not destroy reputations. It would not rewrite history with scandal. But it would change how Dean understood friendship. And legacy. And the weight of being loved by the world. Dean did not leave the lawyer's office immediately. He remained seated long after the afternoon light had shifted from gold to a softer gray, the city beyond the window moving forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet inside that quiet room, something sacred had unfolded. The letter in his hands was not a relic of celebrity. It was not a headline waiting to be revived. It was a voice reaching across 9 years of silence, and it carried the weight of a man who had been both adored and misunderstood. He turned the next page slowly, his breathing steady but deeper now, as though he was bracing himself for something tender rather than dangerous. Elvis's handwriting grew slightly uneven in this section, not frantic, not dramatic, but reflective, like someone pausing between thoughts to measure truth carefully. Elvis wrote about exhaustion, but not the kind that sleep cures. He described the exhaustion that comes from performing strength when one feels uncertain inside. He admitted that somewhere along the journey, applause had begun to sound different to him. It still roared, it still filled arenas, but it no longer filled the quiet places within him. He explained that fame is a strange mirror. It magnifies the image but does not deepen the soul. The more the world saw Elvis Presley, the less people seemed to see Elvis the man who worried about his daughter, who questioned his decisions, who sometimes wished he could sit unnoticed in a diner and simply be ordinary. Dean found himself nodding slightly as he read, because he knew that feeling too well. There had been nights after performances when he removed his tuxedo and stared at himself in the mirror, wondering if the version of him that audiences adored was somehow easier than the version that felt tired and unsure. Elvis described that tension in language that was simple but piercing. He confessed that he had begun to fear that he was becoming an idea instead of a person. "They love the myth," Elvis wrote, "and sometimes I don't know how to compete with the myth." That sentence struck Dean deeply because it revealed not arrogance but vulnerability. Elvis was not afraid of losing popularity, he was afraid of losing himself. The letter shifted gently into memories, and Dean could almost hear Elvis speaking instead of writing. Elvis recalled the first time he had watched Dean perform in a small room years earlier, long before the enormous residencies and sold-out arenas. He remembered being captivated not just by the voice but by the calmness. "You never seemed like you were chasing anything," Elvis wrote. "You looked like you were already home." Dean felt his throat tighten at those words because he had never considered himself anyone's example of balance. Yet Elvis had observed something he himself had not noticed. Elvis wrote that one of the reasons he delayed the letter was because he did not want it read in the shadow of his passing. He did not want grief to distort interpretation. He believed that time clarifies intentions. By 1985, he assumed Dean would have enough distance to see beyond tragedy and focus on meaning. Elvis then began writing about fatherhood, and the tone softened even further. He spoke of Lisa Marie with a tenderness that felt almost fragile on the page. He worried about how she would remember him. Would she see the headlines or the bedtime stories? Would she remember the concerts or the quiet mornings? He admitted that he feared being remembered only as a spectacle. "Tell her I was learning," he wrote. "Tell her I was trying to grow even when it didn't look like it." Dean paused again, pressing his hand gently against the paper as if that small physical contact could bridge time. He had seen Elvis with his daughter. He had seen the sincerity in those moments, the way fame fell away when Elvis knelt to speak at her eye level. The world often forgets that icons are parents, friends, sons. Elvis's greatest fear, Dean realized, was not judgment from critics but misunderstanding from those he loved most. The letter grew more reflective rather than confessional. Elvis explained that he had come to understand something about resilience that he wished he had learned earlier. He had believed strength meant never slowing down, never showing doubt, never disappointing expectations. But now he suspected that true strength might mean stepping back, admitting limits, redefining success. He confessed that he did not always know how to do that. "The stage is loud," he wrote, "and it teaches you to answer every problem with more volume." That metaphor lingered in Dean's mind because it was painfully accurate. When applause becomes the solution to insecurity, silence becomes terrifying. Elvis admitted he was still learning how to sit with silence. As Dean continued reading, he realized that the true purpose of the letter was emerging. Elvis was not seeking exposure or revenge or correction of history. He was asking for stewardship of perspective. He wanted Dean to guard the human parts of his story. He wrote that if people spoke of him as larger than life, Dean should gently remind them that life itself was what he valued most. He asked Dean to speak about the importance of protecting artists from burnout, from isolation, from becoming commodities instead of people. "If I leave anything behind," Elvis wrote, "let it be a warning that talent must be protected, not consumed." Dean felt that line settle into him like responsibility. There was no bitterness in Elvis's words, only awareness. He acknowledged mistakes without dramatizing them. He recognized flaws without condemning himself. He admitted that he sometimes avoided difficult conversations because he feared conflict. He admitted that he sometimes chose performance over rest. But he did not blame anyone. Instead, he described the ecosystem of fame as something complicated, something that requires intentional boundaries. He wrote that he hoped future artists would learn to create circles of trust, small groups of people who cared about the person more than the product. Dean understood then why the letter had been entrusted to him. It was not because he had power. It was because he had never treated Elvis as inventory. The most powerful passage came near the end of this section. Elvis wrote that the world measures legacy by records sold and tickets filled, but he had begun to measure legacy differently. He believed legacy was the quiet influence one person has on another. It was the courage to encourage someone privately. It was the humility to apologize. It was the patience to listen. "If you ever speak about me," he wrote, "tell them I was learning to be kinder to myself." Dean closed his eyes for a moment when he read that. It was such a simple request, yet it carried enormous depth. Elvis was asking to be remembered not as flawless, but as evolving. The final paragraphs of Part 2 turned toward Dean directly. Elvis thanked him for ordinary conversations, for jokes that had nothing to do with business, for advice given without judgment. He admitted that sometimes the most healing moments in his life were not on stage, but in small rooms with people who expected nothing. He wrote that the reason for the 9-year delay was faith. Faith that by 1985, Dean would be ready to receive this not as a burden, but as a gift. Faith that grief would have softened into reflection. Faith that time would transform pain into purpose. Dean finally lowered the pages and leaned back in his chair. The room felt different now, not heavier, but clearer. He understood that the letter was not explaining scandal, it was explaining intention. Elvis had not written to defend himself. He had written to ensure that the person behind the spotlight would not be forgotten. Dean felt both honored and humbled. The responsibility was not explosive, it was intimate. He was being asked to protect the nuance of a life that had been simplified by fame. He gathered the pages carefully, aware that he still had more to read. If part 1 had revealed vulnerability and part 2 had revealed purpose, he sensed that what came next would reveal something even deeper, perhaps the final layer of trust that Elvis had carried silently. Dean was no longer trembling. Instead, he felt steady. The letter was not a storm, it was a bridge. And as he prepared to turn the next page, he knew that whatever remained would not destroy history but illuminate it. Dean adjusted his glasses and leaned forward again, his posture no longer tense but contemplative, as though he had stepped beyond shock and into something more reflective. The first 2 sections of the letter had softened him. They had dismantled the public version of a legend and replaced it with a thoughtful, self-aware man trying to understand his own life. Now, as he continued reading, he sensed that Elvis was moving toward something even more personal, something less about legacy and more about transformation. The handwriting steadied again, and the tone shifted slightly. Not urgent, not sorrowful, but quietly resolute, as though Elvis had reached a point of clarity while writing. Elvis began this section by describing a realization that had come to him slowly over time. He wrote that the greatest danger of success was not failure, but comfort. Comfort in routines that no longer nurtured growth. Comfort in expectations that no longer reflected the heart. Comfort in being admired while privately feeling stagnant. He admitted that for years he had measured progress by external milestones, records, tour acclaim. But somewhere in the early 70s, he had begun to feel an internal restlessness that none of those achievements could soothe. It was not dissatisfaction with his work. It was a deeper hunger for meaning beyond performance. He wrote that he had started asking himself questions he had avoided for most of his career. Who am I when I am not being watched? What do I value when applause fades? What kind of man do I want to become in the second half of my life? Dean felt that question settle into him like an echo of his own thoughts. Aging had a way of pulling those questions forward, whether one invited them or not. Elvis wrote that he had begun to understand that resilience is not merely the ability to endure pressure, but the courage to evolve. He confessed that for a long time he had mistaken consistency for authenticity. He believed staying the same was loyalty to his audience, but he was beginning to suspect that growth required risk, and risk required vulnerability. He worried that the world might not recognize a quieter version of him, a more reflective version, a man who might choose fewer performances and more presence. Sometimes, he wrote, I think the bravest thing I could do would be to disappoint people by changing. That line made Dean pause because it revealed how deeply Elvis feared letting others down. It was not fame that trapped him, it was responsibility. The letter then shifted into memories of small, meaningful moments that had shaped him. Elvis described sitting backstage, once with Dean long after the audience had left. The stage lights dimmed, the echo of applause lingering faintly in the empty hall. He remembered asking Dean whether he ever felt tired of performing, and Dean had replied in his usual calm way that performance was only tiring when it replaced living. Elvis wrote that he had thought about that answer for years. He had come to realize that performing should be an expression of life, not a substitute for it. That understanding had been growing in him quietly, even before he wrote the letter. He described how he had begun to carve out moments of stillness, moments where he deliberately stepped away from noise. He listened to gospel music not for rehearsal, but for peace. He read more. He wrote privately. He spent longer hours talking to his daughter without distractions. Those moments, he admitted, felt more fulfilling than sold-out arenas. Dean sensed that this part of the letter was not regret but preparation. Elvis was explaining the direction his heart had been moving. He wrote that he did not know how much time he would have, but he wanted to be remembered not only as someone who could command a stage, but as someone who was learning to command his own choices. He reflected on the importance of boundaries, admitting that earlier in his career he had said yes to almost everything out of gratitude and ambition. Over time, however, he realized that constant yeses leave no room for intentional no's. He began to understand that protecting one's spirit sometimes requires turning down opportunity. I wish I had learned sooner, he wrote, that saying no is not selfish when it protects your soul. Dean read that sentence twice, knowing how many artists struggle with that lesson. Elvis then wrote about friendship in a way that felt almost sacred. He explained that true friendship is rare in environments built on performance. It requires honesty without agenda and support without spotlight. He thanked Dean for never turning private conversations into public anecdotes, for guarding confidences, for treating vulnerability as something to protect rather than exploit. Elvis admitted that in a world where everyone wanted something, it had meant everything to have someone who simply listened. You let me be quiet, he wrote, and that might have saved me more than applause ever did. Dean's eyes lingered on that line. The idea that simple presence could hold such weight humbled him deeply. As the letter continued, Elvis spoke about legacy again, but this time with greater clarity. He wrote that he no longer believed legacy belonged solely to audiences or critics. Legacy, he decided, belonged first to family and friends. It belonged to the people who carried stories not for profit but for preservation. He asked Dean to remember moments the public never saw, the jokes, the doubts, the laughter after mistakes. He wanted those details to survive because they were proof of humanity. He feared that history flattens complexity, turning lives into timelines. "Don't let me become a timeline," he wrote gently. "Let me remain a person." Dean felt the depth of that request. It was not about correcting history, it was about enriching it. Near the end of this section, Elvis addressed something that felt almost prophetic. He wrote that he believed culture would eventually change. He believed artists in the future would speak more openly about exhaustion, about mental health, about boundaries. He hoped that by 1985 and beyond, conversations would begin to shift. He wanted Dean to be part of that shift, to speak not in scandal but in compassion, to encourage younger performers to guard their well-being fiercely, to remind them that brilliance must be balanced with care. Elvis wrote that resilience is not about pushing through pain indefinitely. It is about recognizing when rest is necessary. He wanted his story to inspire gentleness rather than myth. The final pages of Part 3 carried a tone of gratitude that felt deeply sincere. Elvis thanked Dean not only for friendship, but for example. He wrote that watching Dean navigate fame with composure had taught him that one can remain grounded without withdrawing. He admired Dean's ability to step off stage and become simply a father, a friend, a man. He admitted that he was still learning that balance but had begun valuing it more than ever. "If I had more years," he wrote, "I would spend them refining the man more than the image." Dean read that line slowly, absorbing its quiet weight. When he finally lowered the pages of Part 3, the room felt illuminated rather than heavy. This was not a story of hidden scandal. It was a story of awakening. Elvis had not written out of fear, but out of growth. He had used time as an ally, trusting that perspective would allow this letter to land gently rather than explosively. Dean understood now that the delay was not about secrecy, but maturity. Elvis wanted the letter read by a version of Dean who could carry it with steadiness, not grief. And as Dean sat there in 1985, he realized he was that version. He gathered the pages carefully again, aware that only one section remained. If Part 1 revealed vulnerability and Part 2 revealed purpose and Part 3 revealed growth, then what remained might reveal final instruction, something personal, something intimate, perhaps something that would shape how Dean lived the rest of his own life. He felt no fear now, only anticipation. The letter had already explained more than he expected. It had explained not events, but evolution. And as he prepared to read the final pages, Dean understood that the greatest gift Elvis had left him was not revelation, but responsibility. The responsibility to carry forward a story defined by humanity rather than legend. Dean rested the remaining pages in his lap for a moment before continuing, as though he instinctively understood that the final section would not merely conclude the letter but complete something within him. The afternoon had faded into early evening, and the city lights were beginning to glow outside the office window. Time had moved forward, just as Elvis had predicted it would. And now, 9 years after the letter had been written, Dean felt ready to receive whatever truth remained. The final pages were not dramatic. They did not contain shocking revelations or grand requests. Instead, they carried a calm clarity that felt almost peaceful. Elvis began by acknowledging that no life is defined by a single season. He wrote that people often freeze others in their most visible years, but the most important growth often happens in the quiet stretches that go unseen. He admitted that he had spent much of his early career chasing approval, but as he matured, he began chasing understanding instead. Understanding of himself, of his limitations, of his responsibilities. He realized that success without self-awareness could become hollow. He wanted Dean to know that he had been working quietly to become more aware, more intentional, more grounded. Elvis wrote that he believed resilience is not measured by how loudly one survives, but by how gently one changes. He had come to see that kindness toward oneself is as important as kindness toward others. For years, he had pushed himself relentlessly, believing that endurance was strength. But he was learning that endurance without rest can slowly erode the spirit. He confessed that he wished he had protected his own energy more fiercely. He hoped that future artists would learn from his experience and understand that protecting one's well-being is not selfish, it is necessary. "Tell them," he wrote to Dean, That talent is a gift, but it is also a responsibility. It must be guarded with wisdom. Dean felt those words settle into him like guidance not just for performers, but for anyone carrying great expectation. As the letter continued, Elvis shifted from reflection to gratitude. He thanked Dean again, but this time in deeper detail. He recalled specific moments, the late-night conversations where nothing important was discussed, and yet everything important was felt. He remembered the comfort of sitting in silence without pressure to entertain. He described how rare it was to experience presence without performance. "You gave me space to be quiet," Elvis wrote, "and sometimes quiet is the only place truth can breathe." Dean felt his chest tighten. He had never considered his silence as a gift. He had simply been himself, yet in a world saturated with noise, that steadiness had mattered more than he realized. Elvis then addressed something Dean had not expected. He wrote about forgiveness, not asking for it, but offering it. He explained that as he reflected on his own journey, he had come to understand that everyone involved in the machinery of fame was navigating pressure in their own way. Managers, promoters, executives, they were also responding to demands, expectations, and fears. He did not excuse mistakes, but he recognized that resentment would not heal him. "Bitterness is heavy," he wrote, "and I want to travel lighter." That sentence resonated deeply with Dean because it revealed maturity. Elvis was not leaving behind anger, he was leaving behind understanding. The letter grew even more intimate as it approached its conclusion. Elvis wrote that he had learned something profound about identity. For years, he had believed that identity was something others defined through applause, awards, and reputation. But he had begun to realize that identity is formed in choices no one sees: how one treats family, how one handles disappointment, how one responds to doubt. He hoped that by 1985, Dean would see him not as frozen in youth or tragedy, but as someone who was growing until the very end. He wanted to be remembered not as a finished story, but as an evolving one. Then came the final request, not a demand, not an obligation, but an invitation. Elvis asked Dean to live fully. He asked him not to carry the letter as a burden, but as a reminder. A reminder that fame is temporary, but character is enduring. A reminder that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength. A reminder that the world may remember the stage, but the people closest will remember the heart. "If you ever speak of me," Elvis wrote gently, "let it be with kindness. Let it be with truth. Let it be with balance." Dean understood then that the greatest legacy Elvis sought was not correction of narrative, but preservation of humanity. The final paragraph was simple yet powerful. Elvis wrote that he had chosen March 15, 1985 because he believed Dean would be wiser then, steadier then, capable of holding nuance without being overwhelmed by grief. He trusted time to soften edges. He trusted friendship to remain intact even across years of silence. He ended with gratitude and quiet affection, expressing hope that Dean was surrounded by peace, that he was prioritizing family, that he was protecting his own health and spirit. "We both know," Elvis wrote in his closing lines, "that life moves faster than we expect. Don't let it move past you unnoticed." The letter ended not with drama, but with warmth. "Your friend always." Dean lowered the final page slowly, as though placing something sacred down gently. The office was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. He felt no devastation, no shock. Instead, he felt clarity. The letter had not exposed scandal, it had revealed intention. It had explained not events, but growth. It had shown him that Elvis had been searching for balance, for meaning, for gentleness within a life that often demanded intensity. Dean remained seated for several minutes, reflecting on what the letter truly explained. It explained the quiet sadness he had sometimes seen behind Elvis's smile. It explained the moments when Elvis seemed distant, not out of arrogance but introspection. It explained the depth behind the charm. Most importantly, it explained that even icons crave understanding more than applause. In the months that followed, Dean did not rush to speak publicly about the letter. He honored its tone, measured, compassionate, private. When interviews touched on Elvis, he began emphasizing humanity over mythology. He spoke about the importance of protecting artists from exhaustion. He encouraged younger performers to maintain boundaries and prioritize well-being. He shared stories that revealed warmth and vulnerability rather than spectacle. Without revealing every detail, he allowed the essence of the letter to influence his words. Years later, when asked what Elvis had truly been like, Dean responded thoughtfully. He described a man who was curious, reflective, and evolving. He spoke about how resilience is not loud but steady. He shared how growth often happens in unseen spaces. Those who listened sensed that Dean carried something deeper than anecdote. He carried understanding. By the time Dean himself neared the end of his own life, he often revisited that afternoon in 1985. He realized that the letter had done more than explain Elvis. It had quietly transformed him. It had reminded him to step back from noise, to cherish ordinary moments, to value presence over performance. It had encouraged him to be kinder to himself as well. In the end, the letter explained everything not because it revealed secrets, but because it revealed heart. It revealed that behind every legend stands a human being striving, questioning, learning. It revealed that friendship can outlast applause. It revealed that time, when trusted, can deliver truth gently rather than violently. And as the years passed, Dean understood that Elvis had been right to wait. March 15, 1985 had been the perfect moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mature. It was a moment when grief had softened into wisdom, a moment when legend could finally give way to humanity. The world would always remember the music, the stage, the spotlight. But Dean carried something quieter and far more enduring, the knowledge that even the most celebrated lives are defined not by spectacle, but by the courage to grow, to forgive, and to seek understanding until the very end.